My husband died a year ago, leaving a will. My wife gets everything if she lives in our old farmhouse for 1 year. I moved there. On day 364, I accidentally found a door without a handle in the basement and heard behind it, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled." My name is Eleanor Marsh, and I was 67 years old when my husband Harold died. We had been married for 41 years, 41 years of Sunday pancakes, of arguments about the thermostat, of holding hands in the dark when one of us couldn't sleep. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, Harold was gone. A heart attack. Sudden and clean, the doctor said, as if the word clean could soften anything at all. The grief came in waves, the way everyone told me it would. Some mornings, I woke up and reached for him before I remembered. Some evenings, I set 2 cups of coffee without thinking. I lived in our house in Tucson, the one with the blue shutters and the lemon tree in the yard, and I told myself I was managing. I was not managing, but I was surviving, which felt like enough. Harold's attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Gerald Pruitt, called me 3 weeks after the funeral to read the will. I sat in Gerald's office with its smell of old paper and leather chairs, and I listened. Harold had left me the house in Tucson. He had left modest accounts to his son from his first marriage, Derek, and Derek's wife, Sherry. But the centerpiece of the will, the part that made Gerald pause and clear his throat, was the farmhouse. Harold had inherited the old Marsh farm from his father. It sat on 60 acres outside of a small town called Callan in rural Ohio. A 2-story clapboard house, a barn that leaned slightly south, fields that had not been properly worked in 15 years. The property, Gerald explained, was worth considerably more than it appeared. A development company had been quietly interested in the land for years. The appraised value was somewhere north of $800,000. And Harold's instructions were precise. Eleanor receives the farm and all associated property in full, provided she resides in the farmhouse continuously for a period of 1 year from the date of my death. Should she fail to complete this residency, the property shall pass to my son, Derek Allen Marsh. I remember staring at Gerald's desk and thinking, "Harold, what on earth were you thinking?" Derek was 52 years old. He was Harold's son from a brief first marriage, a man I had known for 4 decades and never truly understood. He was not cruel, exactly. He was careful. Careful in the way that people are careful when they want something and don't want you to see it. Sherry, his wife, was more transparent. She had always looked at Harold's farm the way some women look at a piece of jewelry in a store window. I drove back to Tucson, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Why would Harold do this? We had discussed the farm plenty of times over the years. Harold loved it in the abstract. The memory of his father, the smell of cut grass, the particular light over the Ohio fields in late summer. But he hadn't lived there in 30 years. He had simply held it, the way certain men hold on to the past. I could have refused. A lawyer friend told me I had that option. But $800,000 is not nothing at 67, and more than the money. I wanted to understand why Harold had set this condition. It felt deliberate. It felt like a message I hadn't yet learned to read. So I packed my things, rented out the Tucson house, and drove to Callan, Ohio, in the first week of November. The farmhouse was cold and dark when I arrived. The electricity worked, barely. The kitchen smelled of dust and something older. Mouse droppings, probably, or just decades of disuse. The fields outside the window were gray and flat under a November sky. I stood in the front room with my 2 suitcases, and I thought, 1 year. I can do 1 year. Derek called that evening. "Just checking in," he said, in the tone of a man who was doing no such thing. "Making sure you got there all right." "I'm fine, Derek. Thank you." "You know, Eleanor, that house is in rough shape. It wouldn't be any kind of failure if you decided—" "I'm fine," I said again, more firmly. "I'll talk to you soon." I hung up and looked around the kitchen. His call had taken 4 minutes. He hadn't asked a single question about my drive, my health, or how I was sleeping. Every word had been about the house. The months passed. Winter gave way to a slow, grudging Ohio spring. I cleaned, I repaired what I could afford to repair. I learned the rhythms of the old house. A neighbor named Ruth Kowalski, who farmed 60 acres to the east, brought me pie in December and became something close to a friend. I walked the fields. I found Harold's old journals in a box in the attic and read them slowly, one entry at a time. Derek and Sherry visited in February, in April, and again in June. Each visit followed the same pattern: pleasantries at the door, a slow tour of the house with Sherry's eyes cataloging everything, pointed questions about whether I was really comfortable out here alone, and at least one comment about the difficulty of maintaining old properties. I served them coffee and answered politely and counted the days. By September, I was on day 311. I had found a routine. I had found something that felt, unexpectedly, like peace. And then came day 364. I went into the basement to check on a sump pump that had been running strangely. The basement was low-ceilinged and smelled of earth and old concrete, lit by a single bare bulb. I had been down there a dozen times before, for the pump, for the water heater, for boxes of Harold's old tools. But that afternoon, moving a rusted metal shelf to get better access to the pump, I saw something I had never noticed before: a door. It was set into the far wall, partially hidden behind the shelf and decades of accumulated junk. It was short. I would have to duck to pass through it, and it was made of heavy wood, dark with age. It had no handle. It had no visible lock. It was simply a wooden rectangle in the concrete wall, sealed at its edges with what looked like newer caulk. Not original caulk. Newer. I stood in the basement with the bare bulb swinging slightly above me, and I put my hand flat against the wood. And I heard something. Not a voice. Not a sound I could immediately name. It was a faint, dry rustling, like paper, or like something shifting in a small space, and beneath it, barely audible, a low, mechanical hum that did not match anything I knew about in this house. I stood very still. What had Harold not told me? I did not open the door that night. I want to be clear about why, because looking back, some people might think I was a coward. I was not a coward. I was a 67-year-old woman alone in a farmhouse in rural Ohio, and I had just found a sealed door in my basement that hummed. I was being careful. There is a difference. I went upstairs, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. This was something I had always done in moments of difficulty. Harold used to call it my war council of one. I wrote down everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I needed to find out. What I knew: Harold had left the farm to me under a specific residency condition. Derek wanted this property badly enough to call me 4 minutes after I arrived. Someone had installed newer caulk around a hidden door in the basement at some point after the house had been closed up, meaning after Harold stopped visiting regularly, which was sometime in the early 2000s. What I suspected: the door and whatever was behind it had something to do with why Harold had written that peculiar condition into his will. He wasn't a man who did things without reasons. 41 years had taught me that. What I needed to find out. What was behind that door, and whether Harold had known about it. I also did something else before I went to bed that night. I got out Harold's journals from the box in the attic. I had been reading them slowly, chronologically. And I went directly to the entries from the early 2000s, the last years Harold had visited the farm with any regularity. It took me an hour of reading, but I found it. March 14th, 2003. Drove out to Callan this weekend alone. Found something I wasn't expecting. Went to check the southwest basement wall where Dad always said there was old drainage. Found a space behind the shelving. Going to look into this more carefully. Don't want to say more until I understand what I'm dealing with. And then, 6 weeks later, April 28th, 2003. Spoke to Gerald. Made some decisions. This will require careful planning. Eleanor doesn't need to worry about any of this while I'm alive, but I want to make sure she's protected if anything changes. The farm is more important than it looks. I set the journals down. More important than it looks. Harold, my quiet, deliberate husband, had found something in this basement 20 years ago and had told his lawyer about it and had not told me. And 1 year ago, he had written a will that required me to live here for 12 months before the property became mine. He had been protecting something, or protecting me, or both. The fear I felt sitting at that kitchen table was real. I will not pretend otherwise. I was a widow, alone, on day 364 of a year-long residency, and I had just discovered that the house I was living in contained a secret that my husband had deliberately concealed. That is frightening. Anyone who tells you they would not be frightened is lying. But beneath the fear, something else was growing. It was a feeling I recognized from the earlier, harder years of my life, from raising a child largely alone in my first marriage, from going back to school at 38, from surviving things I don't need to detail here. It was the feeling of a problem that needed solving, and I had always been better at solving problems than at running from them. I made a plan. A real one, not a vague intention. First, I would not open that door alone. Not yet. Whatever was behind it, I needed a witness, and I needed to understand the legal landscape before I touched anything. Second, I would call Gerald Pruitt in the morning. He had known about whatever Harold found in 2003. He owed me an explanation. Third, I would not tell Derek. Not until I understood what I was dealing with. Derek's phone call on the day I arrived, his careful visits, Sherry's cataloging eyes, all of it suddenly felt less like vague greed and more like specific knowledge. Did Derek know about the door? Had Harold told him? Or had Derek found out some other way? Fourth, I would document everything. Starting that night. I took my phone and went back to the basement and photographed the door, the shelf that had hidden it, the newer caulk, and the surrounding wall. I photographed Harold's journal entries. I noted the date and time on every image. When I finally went to bed that night, I lay in the dark of the old farmhouse and I thought about Harold, about the way he had looked at me sometimes, with an expression I had never quite been able to read, something between apology and certainty, as if he knew something was coming and believed, truly believed, that I was capable of handling it. I intended to prove him right. Tomorrow I would call Gerald. Tomorrow I would begin to understand what my husband had left me. Not just the land, but the secret beneath it. And I would do it carefully, quietly, and without letting Derek Marsh know that anything had changed. Because if Derek knew something about this door, and I was increasingly certain that he did, then the clock was no longer just counting down to my inheritance. It was counting down to something else entirely. 1 day remained of the 12 months. 1 day. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning, and I did not sleep well, but I did sleep, And sometimes that is enough. I called Gerald Pruitt at 8 o'clock the next morning. Day 365, the final day of the residency. His secretary put me through after a short wait, and when Gerald's voice came on the line, careful and measured as always, I did not waste time on pleasantries. "Gerald," I said, "I need you to tell me what Harold found in the basement of the Callan farmhouse in the spring of 2003. Silence, long enough to confirm everything. "Eleanor," he said finally, "where are you right now?" "I'm in the kitchen of the farmhouse. I've been here 365 days, Gerald. I found the door last night." Another pause. I could hear him breathing, slow and deliberate, the way lawyers breathe when they are recalculating. "I think," he said, "that you should stay exactly where you are and not touch anything. I'm going to drive out to Callan today. This is a conversation we need to have in person." "Fine," I said. "I'll be here." I made a second pot of coffee and waited. While I waited, I went back to the basement. I did not open the door. I simply stood in front of it and looked at it, and I noticed things I had missed the night before. The caulk on the right side of the frame was slightly different in color from the caulk on the left, as if it had been applied at two different times. And near the base of the door, barely visible unless you crouched, there was a fresh scrape in the concrete floor. The kind of scrape a door makes when it has been opened recently. Recently, not 20 years ago, I stood up slowly and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. Someone had been in this house. Not Harold. Harold had been gone for a year. Someone else had been here, had been in this basement, had opened this door within the past year. While I was living here, I went back upstairs and locked the kitchen door and stood in the front room and thought about every night I had slept in this house. Every morning I had woken to the sounds of the old building settling. Every time I had told myself it was just the wind, just the pipes, just an old house, doing what old houses do. Gerald arrived at 11:30. He was 72, lean and white-haired, and he looked, when I opened the door, like a man who had been carrying a weight for a very long time. We sat at the kitchen table and I put Harold's journals in front of him, open to the March 2003 entry. "Talk," I said. And he did. What Harold had found behind that basement door was a survey document, a very old one, from the 1940s, drafted by the original marshland assessor, along with a sealed metal box containing paperwork that established, clearly and legally, that the 60 acres of the Marsh Farm included a strip of mineral rights land that had never been properly registered in the modern county system. A clerical oversight from decades ago. The kind of thing that could be quietly corrected by the right people or quietly exploited by the wrong ones. The development company that wanted the Marsh property, a company called Halloran Group, had known about this for years. They had been working, Gerald explained carefully, with someone inside the county assessor's office to quietly resolve the discrepancy in their favor before purchasing the land. If the mineral rights issue was resolved incorrectly, it could affect the value of the property significantly, and the terms under which it could be developed. Harold had discovered this. He had gathered the original documents and placed them behind the door for safekeeping, and he had spent the last years of his life working with Gerald to ensure that when the property transferred to me, those documents were intact and properly filed. "The condition in the will," Gerald said, looking at his coffee cup. "The residency requirement." Harold was concerned that if the property transferred quickly, without someone living here, the house might be accessed before you had legal standing to contest anything. "Someone has been in this basement in the last year," I said. "The door was opened recently. I can show you the scrape on the floor." Gerald closed his eyes briefly. "I was afraid of that. Was it Derek?" "Derek," Gerald said slowly. has been in contact with the Halloran Group for approximately 18 months. There it was. The thing I had felt circling for 365 days, finally landing in the room between us. Derek, my husband's son, who had called me within hours of my arrival. Derek, who had visited 3 times and walked through every room with careful eyes. Derek, who stood to inherit the farm if I failed the residency, and who, it now appeared, had been collaborating with the very company trying to devalue it, perhaps to structure a quick sale under terms that would benefit them both. Or perhaps, and this thought arrived fully formed and terrible, perhaps Derek had been coming into this house. Perhaps Derek had a key. "Gerald," I said, "I need you to tell me how to protect those documents, and I need you to tell me today. Because tomorrow this property becomes mine outright, and I intend to make sure that every piece of paper in that basement is legally secured before Derek Marsh makes his next move." Gerald nodded slowly and opened his briefcase. "That," he said, "is exactly why Harold trusted you." Gerald and I spent the rest of that afternoon and the following morning moving carefully and methodically. On day 365, with Gerald present as a legal witness, we entered the basement together. I photographed everything before we touched a single object. Gerald wore gloves. He had thought to bring them. And we opened the door, which swung on dry hinges with a sound like a slow exhale. Behind it was a small storage alcove, maybe 4 feet deep, the walls lined with old wooden shelving. On those shelves, the metal box Harold had described in his journal, a manila envelope sealed with old tape, and a newer document bag, the kind with a zipper and a waterproof lining that had not been there in 2003. That last item was Gerald's addition, he told me. He had placed it there himself 2 years ago at Harold's request, containing certified copies of everything, notarized and dated. The original survey document, the mineral rights paperwork, a letter in Harold's handwriting addressed to me. I did not read Harold's letter in the basement. I carried it upstairs and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time before I opened it. It was 3 pages, written in his careful, slanted hand, and it told me everything. The discovery, the decision to protect the documents through the residency condition, his concern about Derek's increasing contact with outside investors, his belief that the land was worth fighting for, not merely for money, but because it was the last tangible connection to his father and his father's father, and a way of life that deserved to be passed forward with dignity rather than sold off in a backroom arrangement. "You always knew how to hold your ground, Ellie," he had written near the end. "That is why I'm trusting you with this, not because you needed the money, though the money is real, but because you would do this the right way." I set the letter down and pressed my hand flat on the table and took a very slow breath. Then I called my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Okafor, whom I had consulted about the will before leaving Tucson, and I told her everything. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Eleanor, do not move those documents from the property until I'm there. I'll drive out tomorrow." "And Derek?" "Do not contact Derek. Do not respond to Derek. Let me handle the legal notification." I agreed. I was calm. I was clear-headed. I had Harold's letter and Gerald's testimony and a waterproof document bag full of certified copies, and I had completed my 365 days, and I felt, sitting in that kitchen, something that was the closest thing to invincible that a 67-year-old woman with a bad hip and a dead husband has any right to feel. Derek found out the next day. I don't know exactly how. Patricia suspected a contact inside the county clerk's office, someone monitoring filings related to the Marsh property. Whatever the source, Derek called at 7 in the morning before I had finished my first cup of coffee. Eleanor. His voice had changed. The careful pleasantness was gone. I know you found the basement documents. I know you've been talking to Patricia Okafor. I'm going to ask you one time to stop what you're doing. Good morning, Derek, I said. This isn't a game. There are people involved in this who are not patient. The Halloran Group has been working toward this transaction for 4 years. What you're doing, filing complications, talking to lawyers, is going to cost everyone. What I'm doing, I said, is securing property that my husband left to me. Harold was confused at the end. He was sentimental. That will can be contested. Then contest it, I said. Call your lawyer and contest it. That's the legal process, Derek. Use it. A pause. Then Sherry's voice in the background, sharp and close. Derek came back. You don't understand the position you're putting yourself in. Are you threatening me? Silence. Derek, are you threatening me? I'm warning you, he said, as a courtesy. I'll pass your courtesy along to Patricia, I said, and I ended the call. My hands were shaking when I put down the phone. Not from fear. Well, not only from fear. From anger, which is something different and in some ways more useful. I wrote down the exact words of the conversation from memory, time-stamped the note, and emailed it to Patricia within the hour. Over the following 2 days, Derek escalated. He drove to the farmhouse. I saw his truck from the upstairs window and did not answer the door. He had his attorney send a letter claiming undue influence in the original will. He made 2 more phone calls, which I did not answer but recorded via my cell phone's voicemail function. Patricia filed the completed ownership transfer on the morning of day 366. The property was legally mine. The mineral rights discrepancy was flagged for formal correction in my favor. The certified documents were transferred to Patricia's office safe. When Patricia called to confirm, I sat down in Harold's old armchair by the front window, and I looked out at the gray October fields, and I allowed myself to feel, for approximately 10 minutes, the full weight of everything that had happened. Then I called Ruth Kowalski and asked if I could come for dinner. I needed 3 days of normal life before I was ready for whatever came next. Ruth fed me soup and talked to me about her grandchildren and did not ask me a single question about lawyers or documents, and I think those 3 days may have saved me. On the 4th day, Sherry called. Not Derek, Sherry. That was the tell. When Derek wanted something confrontational, he made the call himself. When they wanted something subtle, they sent Sherry. Eleanor, she said, in her warmest voice, the one she used at Christmas. I've been so worried about you. All this legal unpleasantness. It must be so stressful. Derek and I have been talking, and we just want you to know that none of this has to be difficult. I'm listening, I said. The Halloran Group is offering, and I want you to hear this clearly because it's a genuinely wonderful opportunity. They're offering full market value. Every cent. No litigation, no delays, no stress. You sign, you walk away with more money than you could spend in 10 years, and everyone moves on with their lives. I let a moment pass. How much? I said. Not because I was considering it, but because I wanted to know what they thought the property was worth to them. Sherry named a number that was, I noted, approximately 40% below the independent appraisal Patricia had commissioned. That's interesting, I said neutrally. And of course, Sherry continued, her voice warming further, there would be something additional for Derek, for family. Harold would have wanted... Sherry, I said. Harold wrote a will. It's very specific about what Harold wanted. My attorney handles all offers related to the property. You're welcome to contact her. A small pause. I could feel Sherry recalibrating. Eleanor, I just think, at your age, alone out there, managing a property like this long-term is simply not... At my age, I said, I have time, patience, and a very good lawyer. Have a nice afternoon, Sherry. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen, and I noticed something interesting about myself. I felt no temptation whatsoever. Not even the small, traitorous flicker of temptation that I had half expected to feel. Perhaps it was the letter Harold had written me. Perhaps it was 365 days of sleeping in this house, of learning its sounds and its rhythms, of walking its fields in every season. Perhaps it was the look on Sherry's face during those February and April and June visits, that inventory-taking look, which I now understood completely. I was not going to sell this land to the people who had been sneaking into my basement. I wrote down Sherry's call, word for word, and sent it to Patricia. Of the year. Their development permits expire and they have to refile, which costs them significantly. They're running out of time, Eleanor. That's why the offer came now. What do I do? Nothing, Patricia said. You stay quiet. You document everything, and you let them panic. I'm preparing a formal complaint to the county regarding the unauthorized access to your property. The basement door was opened while you were the legal occupant. That's trespassing at minimum. Possibly more, depending on what we can establish about Derek's connection to it. I felt something settle in me. Not quite relief, but the quiet satisfaction of being on solid ground. That week, Ruth introduced me to her son-in-law, a man named Tom Beckett, who had farmed his own land for 30 years and now consulted for agricultural landowners dealing with development pressure. He had seen exactly what I was dealing with, he told me over Ruth's kitchen table, a dozen times. Mineral rights complications, rushed sales, third-party intermediaries with county connections. It was a pattern. You're not alone in this, Tom said, and you're not helpless. What you have, the original documents, the notarized copies, the paper trail, that's stronger than they want you to believe. Ruth poured more coffee and said nothing, which was its own form of kindness. I drove back to the farmhouse that evening, feeling something I had not felt since Harold died. Genuinely supported. Not managed, not patronized, not handled. Supported. By Ruth's soup and Tom's experience and Patricia's sharp legal mind, and I realized, by Harold himself, who had been planning my defense for 20 years. Derek and Sherry, I knew, were watching. They were not finished, but neither was I. They came on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Sherry's phone call. I saw Derek's truck turn onto the farm road from the front window, and I watched it approach with the same feeling I imagine a chess player has when the opponent makes a move they anticipated 3 turns ago. I had not invited them. They had not called ahead. They brought a casserole dish. I could see Sherry carrying it as they came up the porch steps, which was, I thought, a particularly theatrical touch. I opened the door before they knocked. We should talk, Derek said. He looked tired. The careful pleasantness was back, reconstructed, but thinner now, like paint over old wood. I let them in. I did not touch the casserole. I put the kettle on because it gave me something to do with my hands and because the ordinary ritual of making tea is steadying in a way that is hard to explain. We sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, in the room where I had made all my plans, read Harold's letter, and drunk 10 months' worth of early morning coffee alone. We want to clear the air, Sherry began. She had an expression I recognized, warm, reasonable, faintly wounded, the expression of someone who has practiced sincerity in a mirror. Whatever's happened with the lawyers and the paperwork, Derek and I don't want this to be adversarial. Harold wouldn't have wanted that. Harold, I said, wrote very specific instructions. I've been following them. Of course, Derek said, and we respect that. But Eleanor, there's a practical reality here. He leaned forward slightly. This land requires maintenance, investment, management. You're 67 years old. You've already spent a year out here alone. A very good year, I said. Year, and the question you have to ask yourself is what comes after? Do you really want to spend the next decade managing 60 acres of Ohio farmland? Or would you rather? And here, he set a folded paper on the table, sliding it toward me. Consider something that would take care of you for the rest of your life. I looked at the paper without touching it. That's a revised offer from the Halloran Group, Sherry said. Eleanor, it's very fair. More than fair. Does it account for the correct mineral rights value? I said. A small, almost imperceptible tension passed through Derek's face. The mineral rights situation is complicated, he said. There are legal questions still being resolved. There are no unresolved legal questions, I said. My attorney filed the corrected registration 11 days ago. The mineral rights belong to this property. Your offer, whatever it is, doesn't reflect that value, and we both know it. Sherry's warm expression flickered. Eleanor, be reasonable. I am being reasonable, I said. I am being extremely reasonable. I am sitting here having tea with the man who arranged unauthorized access to my basement while I was living in this house, and I am not raising my voice. Derek stood up. The pretense was gone now, completely, like a coat dropping to the floor. You have no proof of that, he said. I have a scrape on a concrete floor, a caulk pattern on a door, and a phone call recorded where you informed me I didn't understand the position I was in, I said. My attorney also has a record of your communications with the Halloran Group, going back 18 months. I wouldn't characterize my position as lacking in evidence, Derek. This will not end well for you, he said. His voice was quiet. That was somehow worse than if he had shouted. Derek. I stood up too, because I was not going to have this conversation sitting down. I am 70 years old in the spring. I have buried a husband and raised a family and built a life, and I have spent a year in this house learning what my husband wanted to leave behind and why it mattered. You will not walk into this kitchen and threaten me over a casserole you didn't even make yourself. Sherry picked up the casserole dish. They left. I stood in the front room and watched the truck go back down the farm road, and then I sat down in Harold's armchair, and I held my own hands for a while, because they had started shaking again. Not the same shaking as after Derek's phone call. This was different. This was the shaking that comes when you have said a true and necessary thing, and your body takes a moment to register what just happened. Was I afraid? Yes. I will not pretend I wasn't. Derek's quiet voice saying this will not end well for you was not nothing. These were not small people to make enemies of. But the fear did something interesting. It clarified. It burned away everything soft and irrelevant and left only the essential question. How far was I willing to go? And I discovered, sitting in Harold's chair in Harold's house on Harold's land, that the answer was all the way. I called Patricia that evening. I told her about the visit, about the revised offer, about Derek's statement. She took notes and said, in her even professional voice, "Good. That was a mistake on their part. People don't usually threaten witnesses." Am I a witness? I said. Eleanor, Patricia said, you may be the plaintiff. The formal hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of November. Weeks into something considerably more weeks, into something considerably more substantial. A civil action against Derek Marsh and the Halloran Group involving trespass, breach of fiduciary duty. Derek had briefly served as a co-signer on one of the estate accounts, which created a legal obligation he had spectacularly violated, and a formal complaint to the state bar regarding the conduct of the Halloran Group's legal representatives in connection with the county assessor matter. The county assessor contact, a man named Phil Draper, who had been quietly adjusting records for the Halloran Group for several years, had been identified. Once Patricia flagged this to the county attorney, Phil Draper had, with remarkable speed, decided to cooperate. I am not a vindictive woman. I want to say that clearly. I did not enjoy any of what the following weeks contained. But I understood, and had understood since the night I found that door, that there is a difference between mercy and surrender, and that the first is a choice you make from strength, and the second is something that happens to you when you run out of options. I was not going to run out of options. The hearing was held in a county courthouse 40 minutes from Callan. Patricia had suggested I dress conservatively, which I found faintly amusing. I had been dressing conservatively since before Derek Marsh was born. I wore the gray wool suit I'd had since Harold's retirement dinner, and I arrived 20 minutes early, and I sat very still, and I waited. Derek and Sherry arrived with 2 attorneys. The Halloran Group's representative, a man named Cass Whitmore, polished and expensive-looking, sat on the other side of the room and did not look at me directly, which told me something. The central issue before the court was simple. Had the property been properly transferred to me under the terms of Harold's will, and had that transfer been interfered with through unlawful means? Patricia had organized the evidence into 3 categories. First, the documentary record establishing my completed residency and the valid ownership transfer. Second, the evidence of unauthorized basement access, including photographs. The forensic analysis of the caulk patterns showing 2 separate application dates, and a statement from the locksmith whose work Patricia had traced. Derek had had a key made for the farmhouse 4 months into my residency, using his signature as Harold's next of kin on a document that had expired the moment the will entered probate. Third, Phil Draper's cooperation agreement, which detailed the specific adjustments made to the county mineral rights registry and the timeline of communications with the Halloran Group. Derek's attorneys tried 3 different angles. The first was that the will's residency condition was unusual enough to suggest Harold's diminished capacity. Gerald dismantled this in approximately 4 minutes, calmly and completely, by producing Harold's medical records from the 3 years preceding his death, which showed no cognitive decline of any kind, and his own notes from the meetings in which Harold had very specifically, very deliberately dictated the terms of the will and explained his reasoning. The second angle was that any basement access had been innocent. Derek checking on the property, ensuring it was maintained, as Harold's son and an interested party. Patricia responded to this by asking Derek's attorney to explain why an innocent visit to a family farmhouse required a falsely obtained key and left fresh marks on a sealed interior door, and why Derek had not mentioned any such visit to the estate attorney or to me. The third angle was the most revealing. Derek's lead attorney argued that the mineral rights documentation I had produced was itself of uncertain provenance, that the chain of custody was unclear, that the documents could have been altered. Patricia stood up and said, in the pleasant, measured tone I had come to admire enormously, "Counselor, those documents were photographed in situ by my client before they were touched, time-stamped, and independently verified, notarized in duplicate, and have already been examined by the county records office, which confirmed their authenticity and incorporated them into the formal registry. Is your client prepared to allege document fraud against a 70-year-old widow, a 30-year estate attorney, and the county of Wyandotte? Because I'd like to know that before we proceed." Silence. Cass Whitmore, the Halloran Group's man, leaned forward and said something quietly to Derek's attorney. And then something happened that I had not entirely expected. Derek looked at me, directly, for the first time since we'd entered the room, and in his face, I saw something I had never seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, but something that looked almost like shame, as if he had, in this moment, actually reckoned with what he had done. Not to the court, not to Patricia's legal arguments, but to the woman who had been married to his father for 41 years and had spent a year alone in an old house to honor a dead man's wish. I held his gaze and I said nothing. His attorney requested a brief recess. During the recess, Cass Whitmore and the Halloran Group's lead counsel approached Patricia in the corridor. I stood 10 feet away and watched. I could not hear everything, but I heard enough. The words settlement and withdraw and full cooperation. Patricia came back to me and said quietly, "They want to end it." "Tell me what that means," I said. "It means they know they've lost," she said. "The Halloran Group is pulling back from the Derrick arrangement. They're not going to throw good money after bad on a case they can't win, and they're worried about the bar complaint and the Draper cooperation adding additional exposure. They'll withdraw all objections to your ownership and issue a formal acknowledgement." "And Derrick?" Patricia looked at me steadily. "That's your call, Eleanor. The civil trespass claim is yours to pursue or withdraw." I thought about Harold's letter. I thought about 41 years. I thought about the look on Derrick's face. "He withdraws all challenges to the will and the ownership transfer," I said. "And he issues a written statement acknowledging that the residency was completed in full. That's the minimum." Patricia nodded. "Done." We went back into the courtroom, and I sat in my gray wool suit, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I waited for it to be finished. The settlement agreement was signed by both parties before noon. I am going to describe what that agreement contained because I believe it matters. Because after everything, the year alone, the basement door, the threat in the kitchen, the casserole Sherry never made, I think the specific shape of the victory is worth recording. Derrick Marsh withdrew, with prejudice, all challenges to Harold's will and to the completed residency. He acknowledged in writing that Eleanor Ruth Marsh had satisfied every condition of the estate document and held full legal title to the Callan farmhouse and all 60 acres of associated land, including the correctly registered mineral rights, free and clear of any competing claim. The Halloran Group issued a formal withdrawal of their development interest in the Marsh property and a written acknowledgement that they had received communications from Derrick Marsh regarding estate planning matters that were not properly disclosed to the relevant parties. A statement that was, as Patricia explained to me later, sufficiently damaging to their professional standing that they would be managing its implications for some time. Phil Draper, the county assessor contact, lost his position. The county opened a formal review of his record adjustments. 2 other properties were identified as having been similarly affected. This had nothing to do with me, precisely, but it had everything to do with the door in my basement and what was behind it. Gerald Pruitt drove out to Callan that afternoon, and we sat on the porch in the November cold, and he told me he had never doubted I would see it through. I told him I had doubted it many times. He said that was probably why Harold had chosen me. I didn't entirely understand what he meant, but I thought about it for a long time afterward. I drove back to the farmhouse that evening alone. I parked in the gravel drive and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house, the peeling white paint, the sagging porch step I still hadn't fixed, the light from the kitchen window falling yellow onto the dead November grass. It looked, I thought, like a house that had been waiting. Not for sale, not for development, not for anyone's financial calculations. Just waiting, the way old houses wait. Patient and full of the specific gravity of accumulated time. I got out of the car and I went inside and I put the kettle on. I called my daughter, Maggie, my daughter from my first marriage, who lived in Portland and who had been following all of this with a fierce, protective attention that had meant more to me than she knew. Maggie cried a little on the phone, which made me cry a little too, and then we both laughed at ourselves and she said, "Mom, I'm coming for Christmas. I want to see this house." "Come," I said. "Bring the kids. It's got 60 acres. I called Patricia and thanked her, properly, because she had earned it. I called Tom Beckett and told him the land was mine and asked if he'd be willing to help me think through what to do with it. He said he'd been hoping I'd ask. I called Ruth Kowalski last because Ruth was the kind of person you save for when you want to say something true without performing it. "It's done," I told her. "Good," she said. "Come for dinner Friday." At the empty alcove were Harold's documents had rested for 20 years. The shelving was dusty, and the space was small and unremarkable. It looked like what it was, a hiding place that had done its job. I thought about Harold finding this place in 2003, alone, standing in this same basement, figuring out what it meant and what to do with it. I thought about him making his decisions quietly and carefully, the way he always had, and leaving me a path through a problem he wasn't sure he'd be alive to solve. "You were right about me," I said out loud, to the empty alcove and the bare bulb above, and the 60 acres of November dark Ohio land above my head. Then I went upstairs and made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table and did not cry, which felt like its own kind of victory. The property was mine. The documents were filed. The challenges were withdrawn. After 1 year, 6 months of legal proceedings, 2 threats, and 1 casserole nobody ate, I had done what Harold believed I could do. I had held my ground. Spring came early to Callan that year. By March, the farmhouse had a new porch step and fresh paint on the south-facing wall, and a kitchen garden that Ruth helped me plan along the fence line. The light in the mornings was extraordinary. I had forgotten, or perhaps never truly known, what early spring looked like on flat Ohio land, the way the fields seemed to absorb the light and hold it. Maggie came for Christmas as promised, with her husband James and their 2 children, 9-year-old Clara and 6-year-old Ben. The farmhouse, which had felt so cavernous and cold in my first November there, filled up with noise and mess and the particular joy of children who have space to run. Ben became obsessed with the barn. Clara wanted to know everything about the mineral rights, which made Patricia laugh when I told her. I did not sell the land. I want to be clear about that, because some people, hearing the story, assume that surviving the fight means taking the money and leaving. I had no interest in leaving. Tom Beckett helped me negotiate a sustainable lease arrangement with a local farming cooperative. Real farmers, 3rd generation, the kind Harold would have liked, who worked 30 of the 60 acres under terms that were fair to everyone and provided me with a modest but reliable income. The remaining 30 acres I kept for walking, for the children when they visited, and for whatever came next. My hip improved, oddly enough. The walking, miles of it every season, seemed to help. My doctor in the nearest town, a sensible woman named Dr. Fenn, told me farm work agreed with me. I said it wasn't farm work exactly. She said it was close enough. I kept writing in the mornings. Not a journal, exactly. Something more like letters. To Harold, to myself, to no one in particular. Ruth read some of them once and said I should think about doing something with them. I said I'd think about it. Derek and Sherry. I know people want to hear this part, and I will tell it plainly, without satisfaction, but without omission either. The formal acknowledgement Derek had signed became, in certain professional circles, a document of record. He had worked in commercial real estate for 20 years, and the Barr complaint and the Draper investigation cast a shadow that was difficult to manage. 2 business partners withdrew from a joint venture Derek had been building for 3 years. The venture collapsed. The financial strain hit the marriage. This I heard from a distant connection, not from any direct intelligence. And by the following spring, Derek and Sherry had separated. I did not feel triumphant about this. I want to be honest. I felt something more complicated, which was sadness for Harold, who had loved Derek after his fashion and would have grieved this. But I also felt clear-eyed about it. These things had not happened to Derek because of me. They had happened because of choices Derek had made over many years, choices that predated me and the will and the farm. I had simply been the consequence he finally couldn't redirect. Sherry moved back to Columbus. I heard she was well. I bore Sherry no particular ill will. She had been greedy and unkind. But she had not been the architect of the scheme, and I was not in the business of pursuing people who had already been deflected. Life was too short, and the mornings too good. The Halloran Group's development division had a difficult fiscal year. Their permits expired, as Patricia had predicted, and the refiling process uncovered additional issues with their county relationships in 3 separate municipalities. I read about it in the regional business paper, the way you read about weather in a distant city, with mild interest and no personal involvement. Phil Draper took a job in private sector records management and, from all accounts, kept his head down. The county review ultimately corrected 4 property records beyond mine. I received a letter of formal acknowledgement from the county assessor's office, which I framed and put in the kitchen. By the following October, 2 years after I had first driven down the farm road in November dark, I hosted a harvest dinner. Ruth and her family, Tom Beckett and his wife, Dr. Fenn, Gerald Pruitt, who drove out from the city and ate 3 helpings of everything. Patricia Okafor, who turned out to be a spectacular person to have dinner with and who had, at some point in the preceding year, become a friend rather than merely an attorney. We sat on the repaired porch in the October evening, and the fields were gold and brown in the last light. And I looked at all of it. These people, this land, this house that had been waiting to be properly inhabited. And I thought about Harold leaving me a problem disguised as a gift and trusting me to find the difference. I had found it. I was still finding it. That, I thought, was probably the point. Harold left me a year, a house, and a secret. He knew what he was doing. The lesson I carry is this: the people who try to rush you toward a decision are usually the ones who benefit from your haste. Take the year. Read the journals. Open the door. I was 67 years old and I held my ground. You can too. What would you have done? Taken the offer or stayed the year? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more coming. Thank you for listening.